Ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to have with me today, guesting on our program, a good friend of mine, a distant cousin, and one of the most famous people ever to come out of the small county, McNary County, West Tennessee, where I was born. Ladies and gentlemen, here is the gentleman whose life is the subject of the movie Walking Tall, Buford Pusser. Hi, Buford. Welcome to the show. It's nice to see you.
Our office believes that the TBI has produced evidence to present an indictment to the McNary County Grand Jury for their consideration against Buford Pusser for the murder of his wife, Pauline.
Pauline Mullins Pusser was murdered in 1967 in what was reported as an ambush shooting. The only other person present, her husband, legendary McNary County Sheriff Buford Pusser, is now considered the prime suspect. Sheriff Pusser was known for crime fighting, carrying a big stick, and his story made it all the way to the big screen in the 1973 film Walking Tall, the 1975 sequel, and the 2004 remake starring Dwayne Johnson.
Before Buford Pusser ever wore a badge, he wore tights. He stepped into wrestling rings where violence was scripted, heroes were decided in advance, and the crowd always knew when to cheer. For a brief moment, he chased fame in a world where every fight had an ending. Real life didn't work that way. When Buford returned home to McNary County, Tennessee, the violence stopped being performative. There were no referees and no guaranteed victories, only corruption, retaliation, and consequences that couldn't be rewritten. The man who once learned how conflict looked on a stage now found himself living inside it, where every confrontation carried a cost that followed him home. For decades, the movie Walking Tall framed that story as a clean, moral battle, a sheriff versus corruption, good versus evil. But legends have a way of hardening before all the facts are settled. In 2025, nearly 60 years after the ambush that killed his wife, authorities announced that a joint review by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the local district attorney's office concluded there was enough evidence that if Buford Pusser were alive today, an indictment for her murder could be presented to a grand jury for consideration. This is the story of the man behind Walking Tall, before Hollywood, before the legend, when violence moved from the ring to real life, and when even the ending we thought we knew was no longer certain. Buford Pusser was born on December 12, 1937, in McNary County, Tennessee. He was the son of Helen and Carl Pusser, the longtime police chief of Adamsville, and law enforcement was a presence in his life from the beginning. Even as a child, Buford stood out, physically imposing, headstrong, and already larger than most of the people around him. A natural athlete, he grew to 6 feet 6 inches and starred in both football and basketball during high school. His size and aggression made him a local standout, traits that would later define both his public image and his private life. After graduating, Buford enlisted in the U.S. Marines, seemingly following a path toward discipline and service. That chapter ended quickly, however, when he was medically discharged due to chronic asthma. In 1957, Pusser left Tennessee for Chicago and entered the city's local pro wrestling scene. It was a natural fit for someone his size, already well over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and intimidating in a way that didn't need explanation. Promoters quickly took notice, branding him Buford the Bull, a name that leaned into both his strength and his temperament. Among the stories that followed him out of the wrestling circuit was an exhibition match billed as a bout against a live grizzly bear, a staple of mid-century carnival wrestling. The bear was controlled, the outcome predetermined, and the danger carefully managed, but the image did its job. Buford wrestled in and around the Chicago area on weekends, taking bookings wherever promoters would have him, while spending his weekdays working long shifts at a factory. It was during this time in Chicago that he met Pauline Mullins, a relationship that quickly became central to his life. The two married on December 5, 1959, and not long afterward left the city and wrestling behind, returning to his home in Tennessee. There, still in his 20s, Buford Pusser entered law enforcement, and in just a few years, he was elected sheriff, becoming the youngest sheriff in Tennessee's history. He'd spent years learning how violence can be staged. Now he was about to learn what it cost when it wasn't. At just 27 years old, Buford began his tenure as sheriff of McNary County. He wasted little time settling in. Almost immediately, he set his sights on the Dixie Mafia and the State Line Mob, two organized crime networks operating along the Tennessee-Mississippi border, pulling in thousands of dollars through illegal moonshine operations. But moonshine was only the entry point. These groups were also tied to illegal gambling, prostitution, robbery, and murder. Going after them meant guaranteeing enemies, and he seemed to accept that as part of the job. He didn't delegate the danger or soften the message. According to the New York Times, Buford made a point of personally destroying seized gambling machines himself, smashing them apart with a pickaxe, part enforcement, part warning. In McNary County, the message was clear. This sheriff wasn't interested in quiet reform. In 1965 alone, Buford shut down 87 illegal whiskey stills, dealing a direct blow to the profits of the Dixie Mafia and the State Line Mob. That level of success came with consequences, and they came fast. Early on, he was stabbed 7 times by gang members who had identified him as a threat. He survived, but it was only the beginning. As his campaign against organized crime intensified, so did the retaliation. Over the course of his tenure, he was shot 8 times, beaten repeatedly, and targeted in attacks that seemed less about intimidation than elimination. But this is where the story gets strange. According to the long-accepted account, it was around 4:30 a.m. on August 12, 1967, when Buford Pusser received a call reporting a disturbance near the Tennessee-Mississippi state line. Despite the hour, his wife Pauline insisted on riding along. Buford agreed, and the two set out together in their car. As they drove down the road, another vehicle suddenly pulled alongside them. Without warning, gunfire erupted. The first volley missed Buford, but struck Pauline in the head. With no cover and no backup, he hit the gas, speeding down the dark road in a desperate attempt to escape. Moments later, the second car returned. More shots were fired. Pauline was struck again. This time, the gunfire reached its intended target. Buford was hit in the face, his jaw nearly destroyed. First responders arrived to a scene of devastation. Pauline was pronounced dead. Her husband was rushed to the hospital, where he spent 18 days recovering, undergoing multiple reconstructive surgeries. He survived, but he would carry the damage for the rest of his life, both visible and unseen. That version of events would become the foundation of the legend, and for decades it went largely unquestioned. Buford responded to the tragedy by cracking down on crime harder than ever, turning his grief into action and cementing himself as a folk hero. Over time, the 3 other men he accused of his wife's murder all met violent ends, and many believed he had a hand in delivering justice. None of it was ever definitively proven, but his relentless pursuit of organized crime, often waged alone, made him a figure of awe and fear, both in Tennessee and beyond. Buford's story came to an untimely end on August 21, 1974, when he suddenly lost control of his Corvette near Adamsville. The car crashed into an embankment and later burst into flames, an ending eerily similar to the sheriff who had preceded him. He was just 36 years old. Officially, his death was ruled an accident, but for those who knew him, the timing and circumstances felt too strange to ignore. Buford Pusser's life, and the legend he left behind, was filled with unanswered questions, some of which would remain unresolved for decades. Little did anyone know. Nearly 60 years later, authorities would reopen the case surrounding his wife's death, casting the story in a whole new light. Even while Buford was still alive, his story had begun to enter the realm of legend. In 1973, the film Walking Tall premiered, dramatizing his life as a lone sheriff standing against crime and corruption. The movie portrayed the man as nearly superhuman, undaunted by danger, unflinching in the face of violence, and always on the side of justice. The success of the film cemented Buford's image in American popular culture. It spawned 2 sequels, a television series, and even a 2004 remake starring another former wrestler, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, introducing the story to a new generation and amplifying the myth. These portrayals cemented Buford's status as a law enforcement icon. His legacy is celebrated in the United States through the Buford Pusser Award, given annually to outstanding police officers during the Buford Pusser Sheriff's Festival in Adamsville, a yearly reminder of the mythic figure Hollywood helped create. Hollywood had immortalized Buford Pusser as a larger-than-life hero, a man who stood alone against corruption, whose courage and violence were simplified into legend. But while the movies celebrated the myth, the real story of his life was far more complicated, and some of its darkest questions remained unanswered. Nearly 6 decades after the ambush that killed his wife, authorities in Tennessee reopened the case. A review by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation and the local district attorney's office revealed evidence that cast the familiar story in a startling new light, raising questions about what really happened that night in 1967 and challenging the legend Hollywood had so carefully built. In 2025, a review of the case files, combined with a subsequent investigation, revealed evidence suggesting that Pauline may have been a victim of domestic violence and highlighted several inconsistencies in the original account of her death. For example, forensic analysis indicated that the cranial trauma Pauline suffered did not match the interior of the car as depicted in the original crime scene photos. While Buford had claimed she was shot inside the vehicle, blood spatter patterns suggested she may have been shot outside of it. Meanwhile, experts examining Buford's own injuries concluded that some of his wounds were consistent with being inflicted at close range, raising questions about the official narrative. The investigation stopped short of definitive conclusions. Buford was long deceased, but it cast the familiar legend in a much darker and more complicated light than the one Hollywood had popularized. Even today, the town he helped save, Adamsville, Tennessee, is split. Some see Buford Pusser as a hero. Others see a man capable of violence and corruption. For many, the facts don't matter, only the story. The museum, the festivals, the tourism, they all depend on the legend holding up. And if it falls, so could a piece of the town itself. As one resident said, "A myth lasts longer than a man, longer than the truth." And in Adamsville, that myth still walks tall, carried in stories, festivals, and memories passed down long after the man himself was gone. Facts may shift, evidence may resurface, and legends may fracture under scrutiny, but the story endures because it gives the town something to hold on to. In the end, it may not matter whether the myth is true or false. What matters is that it survived, standing taller than the truth ever could, and refusing, even now, to lie down.